So, as they're making their rounds, the channel Inspiring Philosophy decides to take a moment and interview Bart Ehrman. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this interview, but what I'd like to focus on is his view on the mark of the beast, 666. Now, they kind of talk about how a lot of things in Revelation get misconstrued or are attributed to everything that happens. For instance, they go over the phrase, there will be wars and rumors of wars, and how everyone at every point in history is saying, oh, there's a war, therefore Revelation, it's the end times. And this is true. This mistake has happened many, many times and is really a notorious mistake. So now with Ukraine, what's everybody going to say? Like Magog and Gog, and it's the end times now. Obviously, on planet Earth, wars happen. So this really isn't that unusual of a thing, but they just point out how the book of Revelation gets misconstrued a lot. Now, while many of the points they make in the interview are fairly valid, the main point I'd like to go over is his take on the mark of the beast, 666.
A little bit more. What is the mark of the beast in your view, and why is it a computer chip on your forehead?
It is not a computer chip on your forehead. I know. There you go. It's like, oh my God, it used to be credit cards. Oh my God, credit card. Now it's like, oh, whatever. So.
All right. So, Inspiring Philosophy has a funny joke, and it's true. What's with the computer chip, or why is the mark of the beast the computer chip on your forehead? This is something that's always come up forever. Computer chips are going to be the mark of the beast, type of thing, and that's what 666 means.
So in Revelation, there are some people who are chosen by God who receive his mark on them, and everybody else gets the mark of God's enemy, the beast. And it's just some kind of tattoo that people get. And if you don't have the tattoo, you're not allowed to buy anything like food. And so Christians are being persecuted. The beast himself, as this might be one of your next questions, but it's 666. Is that one of your questions?
Yeah, let's talk just your view about this, because I know this is as you said, like John knew what he was writing, and he thought the church would understand. We're still trying to figure that out. So just trying to get some insight.
Some of these mysteries are scholars are pretty sure about, and others they debate about. The 666 thing is pretty clear to most scholars.
So notice Bart makes the comment that it's pretty clear to most scholars what 666 means. This, of course, is not true. I mean, the book of Revelation, there is a million views from many different scholars who have many different views on this issue as well as many other issues. The book of Revelation is notorious for lack of consensus on many aspects of the book. So I don't know why he says that, because it's not true.
It's a way of indicating the numerical value of the enemy's name. The enemy is called a beast, and the beast, like in other books of the Bible, the book of Daniel, other books, Revelation, the beast represents both a kingdom and an individual, just as in Daniel chapter 7, that's the same thing. So the beast is both a kingdom and an individual, and it's quite clear who the kingdom is. It's the enemy of the Christians in John's day. That has shed the blood of the Christians, and that is wealthy, and that is exploiting economically the rest of it's Rome. It's the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. 666, the angel tells John that that's the number of a man. And so the first emperor to persecute Christians was Nero, who certainly shed Christian blood. And the number of a man means you take the letters of his name and you add them up. In ancient alphabets, in ancient languages like Greek and Hebrew, you didn't have a separate alphabet and a separate numerical system the way we do. We use a Latin or a Roman alphabet, but we use Arabic numerals. They use their own alphabet for their numerals. And so if you spell Caesar Nero Emperor Nero, spell Caesar Nero in Hebrew letters, the letters add up to 666. So
pretty straightforward. I mean, yeah, that's one thing about the book scholars are pretty sure on, and yet so many laymen today think it's something else entirely.
Yeah, well, Saddam Hussein, it was Gorbachev, and now it's obviously Putin. And it's like, take your pick, whoever's the bad guy at the time. Throughout the Reformation, of course, they said it was the Pope. The Protestants said it's the Pope, and still people say things like that. But you got to put it in some context, and once you do, it's just it lightens it up. You start understanding. Oh my God, that's what that's about.
Okay, so earlier before, he was making the argument that nobody thought the book of Revelation had to do with the future. And now he just used the Protestant Reformation, which he said no one believed in like a future view of Revelation, or hardly anyone believed in a future view of Revelation until the 18th century or 19th century, during the French Revolution, that's really what kicked it all off. Now, if it's not until the 19th century, why did he just say during the Protestant Reformation they viewed the Pope as the beast, or the Antichrist, So that he already just went against his argument just then, that that no one really had this view, or hardly anybody had this view of it applied to their time or some future scenario. Obviously they did, because he just used an example of it.
666, the angel tells John that that's the number of a man. And so the first emperor to persecute Christians was Nero, who certainly shed Christian blood. And the number of a man means you take the letters of his name and you add them up. In ancient alphabets, in ancient languages like Greek and Hebrew, you didn't have a separate alphabet and a separate numerical system the way we do. We use a Latin or a Roman alphabet, but we use Arabic numerals. They use their own alphabet for their numerals. And so if you spell Caesar Nero, Emperor Nero, spell Caesar Nero in Hebrew letters, the letters add up to 666.
All right, I'm surprised that academics such as Bart Ehrman would take this view that you add up the numbers, and that if you spell Caesar Nero and you add it up, it's 666, therefore 666 has to do with Emperor Nero. I'm surprised he takes that view. It's not that it's like an impossibility that could never happen. Of course, there's probability with everything. There's lots of different views, and they each have their different probabilities. But this is sort of the same type of thinking that a lot of conspiracy people have, or just like a lot of sort of fringy type beliefs have about you take this letter, and if you put it back into the Hebrew, and then you add them up, it equals this, which is talking about Walmart. And it's like, it's this type of thinking that goes on among these kind of more fringy groups. And now Bart Ehrman is using that same sort of logic to figure out the mark of the beast, 666. And it's just a little bizarre to me. Again, it's not that it's impossible. Maybe that is what it means. But to act like there's just this absolute certainty that that's what that means, to me is crazy. It's crazy to make that big of a statement, that it's just absolutely certain that that's what 666 means. I get it. Caesar Nero, around the time the book was made. Okay. But besides that proof, what else do you have? I mean, I can make correlations with all kinds of things. I could pick other names and add up to that. Does that mean that person, I could just find other people from that first century time frame, add up their name, and boom, we got the mark of the beast. I mean, that is no way definitive. And I would just never act like there's just this absolute certainty that that's what it is. It's this type of stuff that's always like gets me. There's probabilities to things. There's stuff that's just not 100% knowable. That's okay. That's just the way it is. But, okay, for one, you have to have some sort of precedent for this. This numerology thing where you're adding up numbers and numbers are like codes for things and stuff really is kind of anachronistic of the time. Okay, this is more of a thing that develops later in rabbinic teaching. So we're talking about hundreds of years later. This really develops into a more common type of thing that different rabbis are doing. It's still not 100% mainstream, but it becomes more of a thing about numbers. But that develops hundreds and hundreds of years later. I mean, we're in the wrong time frame. It's not that no one ever did that they, use numbers to mean stuff. It has occasionally, we do have occasional evidence that was used, like by the Greeks or the Romans, but it's not like we have a ton of evidence to suggest that this was like a common thing people did. The other point to be made is that numbers do have a more meaningful use in the Bible, which you think would be the context that you would go to, is like, how are numbers used in the Bible? Because there is a context to how they're used, but it's not in code names. It's not in meaning secret people's names, so you can add up the numbers and figure out it's so-and-so's name. That type of use, not so much. Basically not. The more common use is the idea of like completion, or this is an act of God because this number is being used, those type of things. But the idea that this is somebody's name is a completely new thing that you're bringing into the text that you don't really have a lot of precedent for. If I was to make a statement on what the probability is of what the number 666 means, you would look at how the Bible uses numbers, and then you would go off that precedent. So if 7 is a number of completion, or 8 is like seen as, even better, then 6 is not 7. 6 would then be the incomplete number. It'd sort of be like the opposite in a sense. And that is a more regular use type of situation there and has precedent of how numbers are used than what's going on with Bart Ehrman's field. So if I had to make a claim, I would say that 666 has to do with incompleteness, sort of the opposite of holy and perfect and of God's order, which would be like the number 7 or 8. So 666, especially something repeated 3 times, also has precedent in the Bible. That's usually kind of like an exclamation point or used for emphasis. So those are way more common uses in the Bible, and there is a lot of precedent for that. And his audience would have been used to things repeated 3 times and would have been used to that kind of meaning for numbers, that they mean completeness or something ordained by God, or they mean something that is incomplete and not of God, which would have a different number set to it, like 6. So that's a much more probable outcome for what this has to mean with the mark of the beast than it's actually a secret code that spells the name of Caesar Nero, which has what precedent in the Bible, right? I mean, your only thing is like, okay, Caesar Nero was somewhere around the time the book of Revelation was written, which, I mean, that's a kind of a bad argument, because it's like saying some secret code written in the 20th century had to do with Teddy Roosevelt, and it's like, well, it was written in the 20th century, and Teddy Roosevelt was kind of around the time. Well, that's relative to when you live. I mean, if we're talking about a book that was written, let's say, in the 1990s, Teddy Roosevelt has no relevance to what's going on with them. So that'd be really weird that that's the leader that you would be talking about versus, Bill Clinton. So to just say Caesar Nero, well, there is a lot of other Caesars in the first century. Why Caesar Nero? Like, unless the book was written around the time of Caesar Nero, that'd be better. But I know that many in Bart Ehrman's camp think that it was written towards the 90s, which is again, you could say, well, it's in the first century, true, but that's relative to the people you're talking to. And if it's written in the 90s, that has little bearing. I mean, we're talking about the 60s to the 90s, a lot of time if you're living back then. So it's really an off-the-wall type of belief that I'm really shocked that Bart Ehrman even has. I expect that more from like conspiracy people or like people who are really big into the numerology stuff that are like numbers are everywhere and they have like secret meanings and stuff like that. To act like there's such certainty in that is pretty weird, pretty strange. All right, before we head out, I would just like to emphasize that when studying passages or the Bible, you should always look to the context, again, not just cultural context, but the context of the writing itself, where it is in the book, what's happening around it. Also, the context of other passages that it may be connected to. What's the precedent for the different beliefs that you're picking or discerning through? Because there's lots of choices to be made in how am I going to interpret this passage. And you need a really rigorous amount of evidence to support your view, whatever view or whatever passage you're kind of working through. So I just really want to emphasize that when studying, don't do this thing that Bart Ehrman is doing there, where you just looking at historical context, you find some things, boom, bam, there it is, got it. That's not the best way to do Bible study. Well, that's all for this episode. I'd like to say thank you to my Patreon supporters. We are blessed to have you, and you keep the lights on here. Thank you. If you're new to this channel and you like this episode, go ahead and subscribe, visit our page on Facebook, and check out our other episodes as we address different issues in our world and bring you the truth of Christ in a post-truth culture. Grace and peace, brothers and sisters.